The telephone line from Cairo to 8th Army headquarters crackled with static and bad news. It was the 25th of June, 1942. Somewhere in the western desert, between the Egyptian frontier and the smoking ruins of Tobruk, the British 8th Army was coming apart. General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief Middle East, had just made a decision that would destroy a man's career, save an army, and cost him everything. He was relieving Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie of command of the 8th Army. Effective immediately, in the middle of a retreat, with Rommel's panzers less than 200 miles from Alexandria. It was one of the most disruptive decisions a theatre commander can make. Relieving an army commander during a retreat signals panic. It disrupts the chain of command at the worst possible moment. It tells every officer and every soldier that the high command has lost confidence, that someone must be blamed, that the situation is even worse than they thought. And Auchinleck had appointed Ritchie himself. He had been effectively directing operations over Ritchie's head for weeks, sending lengthy instructions, positioning his own staff officers at 8th Army headquarters, undermining his subordinate before removing him. The critics would say Auchinleck had created this disaster and then sacrificed Ritchie to escape the blame. They would say he should have taken command weeks earlier or let Ritchie fight his own battle. They would say the relief was panic dressed up as decisiveness. They were wrong. Auchinleck destroyed Ritchie's career to save the army. It was the hardest call a commander can make, and it worked. The roots of the crisis ran back 7 months. In November 1941, during Operation Crusader, Auchinleck had faced a similar moment of decision. The 8th Army commander at the time was Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham, a brilliant officer who had conquered Italian East Africa in a lightning campaign. But Cunningham was cracking under the strain of desert warfare against the Afrika Korps. Auchinleck flew forward to the battle headquarters on the 24th of November and found his army commander exhausted, pessimistic, talking of withdrawal. Auchinleck relieved Cunningham on the 26th and looked for a replacement. The obvious choices were unavailable or unsuitable. In desperation, he reached for his own Deputy Chief of Staff, Major General Neil Ritchie. Ritchie was a capable staff officer, well regarded by Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He had served as Brooke's Brigadier General Staff during the evacuation from Dunkirk and later under Auchinleck at Southern Command. He was competent, professional, and loyal. He was also a Major General being asked to command Lieutenant Generals. His last field command had been a battalion in the First World War. He had never commanded a division, let alone a corps. Now he was being asked to command an army in the middle of a desperate battle against the most celebrated German general of the war. Auchinleck intended the appointment to be temporary. He wrote later that Ritchie was perforce pitchforked into a command at a desperate moment, knowing little or nothing of his subordinate commanders or troops, and told to retrieve an apparently lost battle. Auchinleck thought it only right to hold his hand and make himself very readily available for consultation. The temporary appointment became permanent. Ritchie commanded the 8th Army for nearly 7 months, and throughout that time the fundamental problem remained. Ritchie lacked the experience and authority to impose his will on corps commanders who outranked him in seniority and reputation. His subordinates, men like Lieutenant General Willoughby Norrie and Lieutenant General William Gott, saw him as little more than a mouthpiece for Auchinleck. They often ignored or undermined him. Auchinleck tried to compensate by staying close, by sending detailed instructions, by positioning Brigadier Eric Dorman-Smith at 8th Army headquarters as his eyes and ears. This only made things worse. It was the worst of both worlds. Ritchie had the title, but not the authority. Auchinleck had the authority, but not the presence. The 8th Army had 2 commanders and no clear chain of command. The bill came due at Gazala. In May 1942, Rommel held a line running south from the coastal town of Gazala, about 40 miles west of Tobruk. The 8th Army had established a defensive position of fortified boxes protected by minefields, with armoured reserves held back to counter any breakthrough. The British had roughly 100,000 troops and nearly 900 tanks. Rommel had about 90,000 men and 550 tanks. On the 26th of May, Rommel attacked. He sent his Italian infantry against the centre of the line as a diversion, while his armoured force swung around the southern end of the British position, exactly as Auchinleck had warned Ritchie might happen. Auchinleck had written to Ritchie on the 20th of May, suggesting that the armoured reserves be concentrated in a position suitable to meet both a flanking attack around the south or a direct attack through the centre. Ritchie chose a more dispersed and rearward positioning of his two armoured divisions. It was a fatal error. The British armoured brigades were scattered and poorly coordinated. They attacked piecemeal in small groups against concentrated German armour. Tank units charged into anti-tank screens without infantry support. Artillery and armour failed to cooperate. The desert became a graveyard of burning vehicles and dead crews. By the 12th of June, 2 British armoured brigades were captured in a pincer movement and destroyed. Ritchie now had only one surviving armoured brigade. The result was slaughter. The Free French Brigade at Bir Hakeim held out heroically for 2 weeks, buying time that the Eighth Army failed to use effectively. Rommel withdrew into a defensive position called the Cauldron, his back against the British minefields, apparently trapped. The British attacked again and again, losing tanks by the hundred, never coordinating their infantry, armour and artillery into a coherent assault. By the 13th of June, what the British called Black Saturday, Rommel broke out and destroyed the remaining British tank strength. Auchinleck watched from Cairo with growing alarm. He sent instructions. He urged Ritchie to concentrate his armour. He warned against piecemeal attacks. Ritchie listened, agreed, and continued as before. His corps commanders did what they thought best. The Eighth Army bled. On the 14th of June, Auchinleck ordered Ritchie to hold a line running south from Tobruk. On the 16th, Ritchie reported that the line could not be held. The Eighth Army was retreating toward the Egyptian frontier, leaving Tobruk isolated behind it. Tobruk had held out for 8 months in 1941, supplied by sea, an emblem of resistance. Churchill placed enormous symbolic value on the port. An exchange of ambiguous signals between London and Cairo led to 33,000 men, mostly South African, Indian and British, being left to defend a position whose minefields had been stripped for the Gazala line and whose defences had not been maintained. On the 20th of June, Rommel attacked. On the 21st, Tobruk surrendered. 33,000 prisoners, 2,000 tons of fuel, 5,000 tons of provisions, 2,000 vehicles, large stockpiles of ammunition, everything Rommel needed to continue his advance into Egypt. Churchill was in Washington when the news came. President Roosevelt handed him the telegram. Churchill wrote later that it was one of the heaviest blows he could recall during the war. Defeat is one thing, he said. Disgrace is another. At Singapore, 85,000 men had surrendered to inferior numbers of Japanese. Now at Tobruk, 33,000 seasoned soldiers had laid down their arms to perhaps half their number in a single weekend. The Eighth Army was now in full retreat, what some called the Gazala Gallop. Morale was collapsing, units were scattered, communications were failing. Rommel was pursuing with everything he had, his tanks running on captured British fuel. On the 25th of June, Auchinleck made his decision. He flew forward to 8th Army headquarters, relieved Ritchie, and took personal command himself. The danger of complete catastrophe, he wrote later, was too great for me to leave the responsibility with a subordinate. It was the decision he should have made weeks earlier, perhaps months earlier. Perhaps he should never have appointed Ritchie in the first place. But recriminations could wait. The army was dying. Someone had to save it. If you are finding value in these stories of British command decisions, subscribing helps this channel continue telling them. Auchinleck had taken command. Now he had to use it. His first order was to abandon the position at Mersa Matruh, about 100 miles east of the frontier. Ritchie had planned to stand there. Auchinleck recognized that the same problems that had destroyed the Gazala position would destroy this one. The British were inferior in armour after weeks of losses. Rommel would either break through the centre or swing around the open southern flank. The army would be destroyed in detail. Auchinleck ordered a fighting withdrawal another 100 miles east to El Alamein. It was a tiny railway halt on the coast, 60 miles west of Alexandria, but it had one decisive advantage. 40 miles to the south lay the Qattara Depression, a vast area of soft sand and salt marshes impassable to tanks and heavy vehicles. At El Alamein, the Desert War became a siege. There was no open flank. Rommel could not swing around the British position. He would have to attack head-on into prepared defences against an army that could finally concentrate its strength. The retreat to Alamein was chaos. The Battle of Mersa Matruh on the 26th and 27th of June saw signal failures, disorganisation, and the 10-corps line of retreat cut off by German armour. The corps broke out at night, collided with Axis forces, and lost over 6,000 prisoners. Cairo headquarters burned documents in what became known as Ash Wednesday. The British embassy prepared to evacuate. Rommel reached the Alamein position on the 30th of June. His forces were exhausted. The Afrika Korps had perhaps 50 serviceable tanks. His men had been fighting and advancing for over a month. His supply lines stretched over 1,000 miles back to Tripoli. But he believed the British were beaten. One more push would break them. Auchinleck believed otherwise. He had reorganized his battered army during the retreat. He had positioned fresh formations at the strong points along the Alamein line. The 1st South African Division held the coastal box. The 18th Indian Brigade held the Deir el-Shein box. The New Zealand Division and other formations covered the southern sector toward the depression. Behind them, what remained of the British armour waited as a mobile reserve. On the 1st of July, Rommel attacked. His plan was simple. The 90th Light Division would advance along the coast road toward Alexandria, while the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions swung south to envelop the British position from behind. It was the same flanking manoeuvre that had worked at Gazala, but this time there was no open flank to turn. The plan failed. The 90th Light ran into concentrated artillery fire from the Alamein box and stopped. The Afrika Korps overran the Deir el-Shein position after fierce resistance from the 18th Indian Brigade, but lost precious time and momentum. When the panzers turned north to cut the coast road, they found not a broken rabble, but organised resistance. The British armour, what remained of it, fought with desperate determination. The artillery laid down accurate fire. The infantry held their positions. Auchinleck counter-attacked. On the 2nd of July, Australian and South African troops struck the Italian Sabratha Division in the north, destroying it as a fighting force and capturing hundreds of prisoners. The Australians, with Valentine tanks in support, took the eastern part of Tel el-Isa. The attack threatened Rommel's headquarters, which was only 3 miles away. An impromptu defensive position had to be set up. Rommel himself rushed north with a battle group from the 15th Panzer. His counterattack stopped by artillery fire from the Alamein box. He cancelled his own offensive and rushed to stabilise the line. For the next 3 weeks, the two armies fought a grinding battle of attack and counterattack. Neither could break through. Auchinleck launched repeated offensives, trying to destroy the Italian divisions that formed the weaker link in Rommel's line. The attacks were poorly coordinated and suffered heavy casualties, but they kept Rommel off balance, forced him to use his precious German reserves to shore up his Italian allies, and denied him the initiative. By the end of July, Rommel knew he had lost. The advance that had carried him from Gazala to within 60 miles of Alexandria had stopped. His army was exhausted. His supplies were running short. He would have to wait for reinforcements before trying again. The First Battle of El Alamein cost the 8th Army roughly 13,250 casualties. Axis losses were at least 10,000, including 7,000 prisoners. Neither side had achieved its objectives. But there was a crucial difference. Auchinleck had stopped Rommel's advance. It was the first time in the Desert War that Rommel had been permanently halted. General Thomas Corbett, Auchinleck's chief of staff, understood what had been achieved. "Your achievement in stopping the rot in a beaten army," he wrote to Auchinleck after the battle, "in restoring morale so speedily, in wresting the initiative from a triumphant enemy, and inflicting on him crippling losses, will one day be recognised." Churchill did not agree. On the 5th of August, Churchill and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, flew to Cairo. They had come to make changes. The Prime Minister was impatient. He wanted offensive action. He wanted a general who would attack. Auchinleck insisted that the army needed time to rest, reorganise and train before resuming operations. He proposed September at the earliest. Churchill would not wait. On the 6th of August, he relieved Auchinleck as Commander-in-Chief Middle East, replacing him with General Harold Alexander. For command of the 8th Army, Churchill chose Lieutenant General William Gott, the exhausted corps commander who had been in action since the beginning of the Desert War. Gott was killed the next day when his aircraft was shot down. His replacement was Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery arrived at 8th Army headquarters on the 13th of August and immediately began claiming credit for everything Auchinleck had done. He announced that there would be no further retreat, that the army would stand and fight where it was, that there would be no withdrawal and no surrender. In fact, Auchinleck had already given the same order. He announced that the army would fight a defensive battle at Alamein Ridge if Rommel attacked again. In fact, Auchinleck and Dorman Smith had already planned that battle in detail, including the positioning of forces and the tactical approach. He reorganised the army structure and worked to restore morale through personal visits to every unit. In fact, Auchinleck had already begun both processes during July. While it was a political necessity for Montgomery to distance himself from his predecessors, the planning that Auchinleck, Dorman Smith, and Brigadier Freddy de Guingamp had developed for defensive and offensive operations was retained and laid the groundwork for the battles that followed. Montgomery kept de Guingamp as his chief of staff. He kept the defensive positions Auchinleck had established. He kept the plans Auchinleck had made. When Rommel attacked at Alam-Halfa on the 30th of August, Montgomery fought almost exactly the battle Auchinleck had planned. He won. When Montgomery launched his own offensive at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October, he did so with an army that was twice the size of Rommel's, with air superiority, with American Sherman tanks, with secure supply lines and intelligence from ultra-decrypts telling him every move his enemy planned to make. Montgomery won the Second Battle of El Alamein. It was a great victory. Churchill famously said that before Alamein we never had a victory, and after Alamein we never had a defeat. The statement was untrue, but it captured the public mood. Montgomery became a national hero. Auchinleck was forgotten, but Montgomery's victory was only possible because Auchinleck had stopped Rommel in July. The line that Montgomery defended was the line Auchinleck had chosen. The army that Montgomery commanded was the army Auchinleck had saved. The defensive position that made the Second Battle of Alamein winnable was the position where Auchinleck had fought the first. Auchinleck spent almost a year without a command before being appointed Commander-in-Chief India in June 1943. In that role, his support for General William Slim's 14th Army was instrumental in the reconquest of Burma. Slim himself acknowledged the debt. "It was a good day for us when he took command of India," Slim wrote. "The 14th Army owed much to his unselfish support and never-failing understanding. Without him and what he and the Army of India did for us, we could not have existed, let alone conquered." Ritchie recovered his career as well. Unlike Cunningham, whom Auchinleck had relieved, and who never held another field command, Ritchie was given the 52nd Division and later commanded the 12th Corps during the Normandy campaign and the advance into Germany. The fact that he regained active command reflected the high esteem in which he was held by Alan Brooke. It also suggested that the failure at Gazala was not solely his fault. The core tension of this story is not complicated. Auchinleck destroyed Ritchie's career to save the army. Then Churchill destroyed Auchinleck's career and gave the credit to someone else. Auchinleck made mistakes. He appointed Ritchie knowing he lacked experience. He failed to remove him when it became clear the arrangement was not working. He tried to command by remote control when he should have taken direct command or given Ritchie genuine independence. When the crisis came, he acted too late. But when he did act, he saved the Eighth Army. He chose the position at El Alamein. He organized the defense. He stopped Rommel. He did what had to be done, knowing it would destroy a man who trusted him, knowing it would look like panic, knowing that if he failed, he would be blamed for everything. He did not fail. Rommel never took Alexandria. The Suez Canal remained in British hands. The Middle Eastern oil fields stayed out of German reach. Everything that followed, the victory at Second Alamein, the expulsion of the Axis from North Africa, the invasions of Sicily and Italy, all of it was possible because Auchinleck held the line at El Alamein in July 1942. Churchill wanted a general who would attack. He got one, but he should have remembered that before you can attack, you must first survive. And it was Auchinleck, not Montgomery, who ensured that the Eighth Army survived. Some historians have tried to diminish First Alamein, to argue it was merely the end of the Battle of Gazala rather than a battle in its own right. Charles Richardson, a senior Eighth Army staff officer, once commented that no battle entitled to the name First Alamein ever took place. But this misses the point. What Auchinleck achieved in July 1942 was not a decisive victory in the traditional sense. It was something harder and more necessary. He took a beaten army and made it fight again. He took a position of desperation and turned it into a position of strength. He took a general in full retreat and gave him a line he could hold. The German High Command understood what had happened, even if Churchill did not. Rommel's bid for the Nile Delta had failed. The Afrika Korps would never again threaten Alexandria or the Suez Canal. The strategic initiative in North Africa had passed, imperceptibly but irrevocably, from the Axis to the Allies. The desert kept no monuments for the man who saved it, but the line at Alamein held, and that was enough.